Good evening, this is Melanie Moon, and I am continuing with the book Race in the City about the city of Cincinnati. And we're on chapter 3, which was written by James Oliver Horton and Stacy Flaherty. The title of this essay is Black Leadership in Antebellum, Cincinnati. Standing before the Ohio State gathering of Black representatives in the Bethel Church of Columbus in early January 1849, Cincinnati delegate Reverend Wallace Shelton addressed the two major issues of the convention. On the question of slavery, Reverend Shelton stood firmly on the ground of abolition, urging that blacks be willing to work with those whites who advocated freedom, but dismissed those who refused to condemn slaveholding and those who, quote, would fellowship with slaveholders on their abettors, unquote. On the question of colonization, the other burning issue of the convention, Reverend Shelton was just as candid. Quote, "We are free-born Americans, but are robbed of our rights by our American-born brethren," unquote. Not limited to a concern for the rights of free blacks alone, he desired to maintain and increase the pressure of the anti-slavery movement. Reverend Shelton counseled rejection of the American Colonization Society's plan to transplant free blacks to West Africa. Quote, "Stay where you are," unquote, he urged, quote, "and never leave this land as long as one chain is to be heard clanking or the cry of millions is to be heard floating on every breeze," unquote. For the free blacks of Cincinnati in the years before the Civil War, these were the great national issues. And with minor exception, these were the popular positions. In this regard, Shelton and his fellow Cincinnati representatives, Charles M. Wilson, John T. Ward, and James McGowan, reflected the views of the city's black community. They were chosen in the fall of 1848 at a citywide meeting of Cincinnati blacks called to consider local and national concerns of the race. During the next 2 decades, Black Cincinnatians gathered on numerous occasions to discuss mutual problems and to plan concerted action. In the process, they selected from their number those deemed specially suited for leadership. This chapter is a study of those chosen to lead. It focuses on leaders drawn from the local Cincinnati community, even though African Americans in antebellum Cincinnati were not unaware of or unaffected by the great national black leaders of the period. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, William Wells Brown, Martin R. Delaney, and other nationally and internationally known black Americans visited the city and commanded the respect of loyalty of black Cincinnati. But theirs was a more periodic and a more distant influence. Those who provided day-to-day direction lived in the local community. The relative importance of national and local black leaders is a well-discussed issue. Many 19th century blacks believed that, quote, "the only leaders among the colored people were those whom they personally knew and who lived and associated among them," unquote. A century later, historian Nell Irvin Painter argued that we are likely to misunderstand local concerns if we focus on the influence of national black leaders. She and others have argued persuasively that although national black leaders influenced local black communities, they often depended on white patronage for the basis of their power and were not necessarily in touch with grassroots black sentiment. The local leaders of Cincinnati's black community had many distinguishing characteristics. They were in several ways advantaged members of the community, yet they were not an isolated elite. Most lived among and interacted with Black Cincinnatians regularly, sharing their concerns. These assertions are based on our analysis of data on 82 Cincinnati Blacks whose names were drawn from primary documents produced between 1830 and 1860. These included lists of officers elected at community gatherings of Black Cincinnatians, lists of community representatives selected to attend local, state, and national conventions, lists of organizational leaders, and lists of those elected to serve on the school committee of the separate African American school system created during the 1840s. We distinguish between local Black achievers and leaders. Those eligible for our leadership list, see Table 3.1, must have headed a group or have been selected for an organizational office or position. And this next page is the table. Table 3.1, Cincinnati African American leaders identified by this particular study. And it lists them in alphabetical order from A to W. It is not enough to have been successful in business or to have accumulated great wealth. Jesse Beakley, for example, was a wealthy roofer from Virginia with real estate worth more than $10,000 in 1850, but he was not included in our list of Cincinnati leaders. Although he achieved great local prominence because became a man of influence and associated with several community leaders. So far as we could determine, Beakley did not lead any community organizations, nor was he elected to any representative office. It might be argued that achievers are leaders in terms of the example they set, especially in view of the importance placed on Black role models. But we elected a more narrow and, we believe, a more defensible definition. We traced the names of Black leaders on our list through the federal census for 1850 and 1860, Cincinnati probate records, including wills and personal property inventories, city directories, local and national newspapers, a list of officials elected to the city's African American School Board, and records of Ohio State colored conventions, and the records of the National Colored Conventions. The extensive records compiled by the Black Abolitionist Papers Project were also used to track the activities of Cincinnati Black leaders. There are disadvantages inherent in this methodology. Because our leadership list was assembled from public documents and from formal organizational records, it is heavily biased in favor of men. Black women were less likely to be elected to organizational office or be community delegates to state or national conventions. In fact, Black men disagreed over whether women should be allowed to attend these gatherings, other than in limited, often domestic roles. In a few instances, Black women successfully protested their exclusion, but they remained underrepresented among the community-wide elected representatives. Several women's organizations were active in the city throughout the antebellum period. The Colored Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Circle of Cincinnati, the Daughters of Temperance, and countless bazaars and fairs organized and administered by Black women raised funds for community services and protest action. African American women played a vital role in the financial support of Cincinnati's many male-dominated political and social organizations. Unfortunately, records of these activities are not abundant, and even when they are available, they tend not to give the names of elected officers. It is also noteworthy that leadership roles among women were generally different from those among men. Decision-making in female organizations was often by the consensus of the membership, with less emphasis placed on individual leaders. Names of women were gathered where possible, but it is certain that black female leadership was more extensive and of greater consequence than the data here suggests. Another disadvantage of our selection process is that it favors the leaders of established and thus more middle-class oriented organizations over the leaders of less formally organized actions of the poor. Yet, since this study is concerned with the extent to which formally selected community leadership associated with the masses of poor that constituted Black Cincinnati during this period, it does reveal information about leadership at all levels of the society. To judge the connections between these leaders and the city's Black community, we drew several comparisons. We compared leaders and non-leaders in terms of regional birthplace, shade of color, marriage patterns, literacy rate, residential patterns, and occupational patterns. Our findings not only shed light on the differences and similarities between Black leaders and non-leaders, but also suggested structural patterns within the Black community that marked Cincinnati's distinctive position as a border city. Our analysis is mindful of the specific social, economic, and political setting within which the Cincinnati Black community took shape. As Blacks traveled from one community to another in the United States, they found many familiar lifestyles and institutional forms, but no single model explains the variety of Black community structures except in the most general sense. Although they shared common concerns and problems with Blacks elsewhere, Cincinnati's African Americans shaped their community to fit their local circumstances. The city was geographically northern, but it looked southward economically and politically. It was a border city within which the traditions of North and South met, shaping lifestyles and race relations. The Northwest Ordinance of 1797 made slavery illegal within the Ohio Territory, and when Ohio joined the Union in 1803, it did so as a free state. Yet, Cincinnati, the fifth largest city in the nation by 1850 and the most important city west of the Alleghenies, was situated on the southern boundary of the state, just across the Ohio River from slaveholding Kentucky. Thus, it had substantial and regular contact with the South. The Cumberland Road traversed Ohio and brought settlers from the slave states of Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. The Ohio River, which connected to the Mississippi, regularly carried not only Southern settlers, but traders and planters from the Deep South on their way to do business in the city. Southern businessmen, attracted by the city's reputation as Porkopolis, came to Cincinnati to buy meats and other foodstuffs for the South's plantations. Economically and socially, Cincinnati was tied to the southern port cities along the Mississippi River. By 1829, Cincinnati's river commerce, which began modestly in 1805, had a value of over $7 million. Much of this money came from trade within the South, or trade with the South. Throughout the Antebellum years, Cincinnati remained a major commerce and financial center for Southern planters. The patronage of visiting planters became an important part of the city's restaurants and hotel business. Although some visitors to Cincinnati during these years were unimpressed with the unstructured growth of this, quote, this ditch between the hills, unquote, by 1840, the steamboat had turned this once small, muddy riverfront town into the, quote, Queen City of the West, unquote. The strong Southern influence in the city greatly affected white attitudes toward the free black community. White Cincinnatians, many of whom had migrated from the South to escape the presence of blacks, slave or free, were troubled by the growing African American presence, and they launched local and statewide efforts to curb the growth of the black population. In 1804 and again in 1807, the Ohio legislature passed black laws that, among other things, restricted African American settlement in the state. These laws required black immigrants to register with local authorities within 20 days of their arrival in Ohio and to post a $500 bond guaranteeing their good conduct and self-support. Despite restrictions and periodic violence against the African American community, the black population of Cincinnati grew to 1,100 in 1830 of 24,831 total population, to over 3,200 of 112,198 by mid-century, and to over 3,750 of 161,044 by 1860. The city never faced a realistic threat of overwhelming numbers of African Americans. However, because the white population, especially Irish and German immigrants, grew even more rapidly, the percentage of blacks in the city population actually dropped from almost 4.5% in 1830 to just over 2% on the eve of the Civil War. And there's a footnote there. There have been footnotes throughout this, but I'm just not stopping to give you all the footnotes. As I stated before, all of this information is firmly grounded in primary resources, some of which I have gone to the internet to find for myself, and even some of the articles written in black newspapers, The Philanthropist being one, have been digitized. I've downloaded a couple of them, and I'm going to post them as I read. Once I've read through the book, I will post some of those articles for you to see the authenticity of what I'm reading in these texts. Still, Cincinnati's black community was among the most important in the antebellum North. It was on the front lines of the Underground Railroad and the anti-slavery movement. The city was the receiving ground for untold numbers of runaway slaves from south of the Ohio River. Individual blacks provided food, clothing, shelter, and a variety of other services, from financial support and jobs to direct action in defense of fugitives in need. Community leaders often coordinated and facilitated these activities, sometimes calling upon the assistance of white reformers with whom they had influence. There is another table here. I'm sure it's going to be referred to. This is Table 3.2, Regional Origins of Cincinnati Blacks. They also filled crucial roles in civil rights actions and in efforts at community self-help. Peter H. Clark, for example, led the fight for black education. Although public education was mandated in Cincinnati through state law as early as 1825, no public schools were made available for African Americans. A series of provisions throughout the 1830s alternated between allowing property taxes collected from blacks to go toward the support of black education and disallowing such a provision. So although they were paying taxes, those taxes went to educate whites. There were no schools for the blacks. Finally, in 1849, blacks were assured by the state that a portion of their taxes would be applied toward the support of their schools. Further, They were given control over their own schools, and males were permitted to elect an independent school board. Clark was elected as the head of the board, and under his leadership, the community at last received enough public funds to construct a school building in 1858. Footnote. Within the hostile and restrictive atmosphere, Cincinnati blacks carved out a community that both reflected and contrasted with the city's wider society. Like its whites, Cincinnati's African Americans were largely Southern born, a fact that added to the city's distinctively Southern flavor. At mid-century, over 70% of the city's officials recorded adult black population was Southern born. There it is, table 3.2. Almost two-thirds of them were born in the states of neighboring Virginia and Kentucky, but a number of them, almost one-fifth, came from the Deep South, reflecting the significance of Mississippi, Ohio River travel routes. These figures do not include the hundreds of fugitive slaves in the city and therefore underestimates the true proportion of Southern-born blacks. Footnote. The Southern character of the city and of its black community helped to determine the demographics of the local black leadership. At mid-century, more than three-quarters of those who spoke and acted for the community or who led it into action were Southern-born, just 2 percentage points more than for Cincinnati blacks generally. By 1860, the percentage of leaders born in the South had dropped to 55%, but this decline was not as dramatic as it appeared. It did not indicate a rise in the number of blacks entering Ohio from other northern states and taking over leadership roles. Instead, it reflected the numbers of Ohio-born blacks growing to maturity and becoming leaders, often following in the footsteps of their Southern-born parents. Like others in the community, most non-Ohio-born leaders hailed from southern border states, and, like other Southern-born blacks, they were deeply concerned about the welfare of friends and family left behind in slavery. Elizabeth Coleman and Sarah Ernest were examples of Southern-born women who led groups in Cincinnati dedicated to assisting fugitive slaves. They led the Anti-Slavery Sewing Society, which produced clothing for runaways. Generally, fugitives arrived in Cincinnati with inadequate winter clothing, so the society's efforts were especially important to fugitives bound for Canada. James Brown was a leader in the Canadian immigration movement, and he was also a Southerner from Kentucky. He made several trips into his home state from Cincinnati to aid slaves in escaping to Ohio. On one occasion, he was captured in Louisville, but he was able to escape, after which he settled in Canada. Other Southerners, active in the Underground Railroad, also gained influence among Cincinnati blacks. P.B. Ferguson, a cabinet maker from Virginia, represented Cincinnati at the 1858 Ohio State Convention of Free Blacks, while William D. Goff, a barber from Tennessee, was elected secretary to that body. The Kentuckian Dennis Hill was president of the Cincinnati Union Society of Colored Persons during the 1830s and remained active throughout the 1840s in various leadership roles within that and several other local organizations. In 1850, the proportion of leaders born in northern states approximated the proportion of northern-born black Cincinnatians. Almost all of these northern-born leaders, however, were natives of Ohio. Only 4 leaders were not, 3 from Pennsylvania and 1 from Indiana. The most prominent non-Ohio-born leader was William Darnes of Pennsylvania, who was vice president of the 1852 State Freedmen's Convention and chairman of a Cincinnati black anti-slavery group during the 1830s that heartily endorsed the militancy of William Lloyd Garrison. By 1860, Darnes and his fellow Northern-born leaders had been joined by 2 New Yorkers, but the number of Northerners among the leadership remained small, reflecting the small number of Northern-born African Americans in the city. Thus, on the eve of the Civil War, Cincinnati's black leaders were more likely to hail from the local region than other African Americans in the city. But most continued to reflect the Southern flavor of the general population. The leaders were generally more mature than their fellow black Cincinnatians. See Table 3.3. Their mean age was 35.7 years in 1850, about 3 years older than that of all black adults in the city. Their median age, 33.5 years, was also higher than that of all black adults, indicating the higher proportion of leaders over 40 years of age. Almost 2/3, 38% of the leaders were 40 years or older, as compared to 1/5 of other black adults. By 1860, the mean age of all black adults in the city had advanced, but the leadership remained older than other Cincinnati blacks. The proportion of black leaders over 40 rose to 49%, moving forward ahead of the general African American population, in which the same proportion stood at less than 25%. The increased percentage of black leaders over the age of 40 and the general rise in the mean age reflected the fact that those who led in the 1840s continued to lead in the 1850s even as they grew older. Their age difference between leaders and non-leaders suggested that maturity was a consideration in the selection of community leadership. Ohio-born leaders were an exception to this rule. With an average age of just over 25 years in 1850 and under 30 by 1860, they were quite a bit younger than other leaders, younger even than the general African American population of the city. Black Ohioans were also overrepresented among the city's black leaders. This seems to indicate the importance of residential persistence. Ohio-born William Henry Harrison was active in the local abolition movement and was also elected trustee to the Colored School Board Committee. Serving with Harrison on the school board was Joseph C. Corbin, also an Ohio native, only in his mid-20s by 1860. Corbin was one of the youngest on the board. Another young Ohio-born leader was Eveline Cooper, who served on the Black State Convention and was an officer of the Ohio Female Anti-Slavery Society. The relative youth of Ohio-born leaders notwithstanding, by the mid-19th century, those chosen to lead were mature adults, typically older than community people generally. African American leaders, reflecting their maturity, were generally married people with families. John Liverpool, while in his early 40s, led the campaign against African colonization. Like most blacks in Cincinnati, he opposed the aim of the American Colonization Society to encourage free African Americans to migrate to West Africa. Francis, his wife, John Jr., his son, Eliza and Elizabeth, his daughter-in-law, and Thomas, his grandson, were all active in the cause of anti-slavery and civil rights. Liverpool remained active through the early 1850s and was selected to represent Hamilton County at the State Convention of Colored Freemen in 1852. But by that time, he was in his 50s, one of Cincinnati's older black leaders. It was common for several members of a single family to be involved in reform activities. 4 of the 12 women in our leadership group had male relatives who were also identified as leaders, and all of them had relatives who were active in one way or another. Jane J. Jackson and Mary Gibson headed up a committee that put on a fair in 1858 for the benefit of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. They were also delegates to the Ohio Black Convention during the late 1850s, as were both their husbands. Jane Jackson's husband, John, served on the Central Committee for the convention. Victoria Ball also served on various committees of the convention, while her husband, James, was an elected official of several local abolitionist meetings. This pattern was not limited to Cincinnati, but was significant elsewhere in the state as well. A large number of the women who attended Ohio Black conventions between 1849 and 1858 were related to men in attendance. Although some men would have had the ladies, quote unquote, present only in supportive roles, providing music and food for the gatherings, Black women made clear their intention to assert themselves as full members of these conventions. In one of the earliest statewide meetings, the women in attendance served notice that they did not intend to take an inferior role. Quote, "Whereas we, the ladies, have been invited to attend the convention and have been deprived of a voice, which we, the ladies, deem wrong and shameful, therefore resolved that we will attend no more after tonight, unless the privilege is granted." Unquote. Footnote. A resolution encouraging women's participation was immediately brought to the floor. 2 men, W. Hurst Burnham of Muskingum County and G. J. Reynolds from Erie County, were opposed. But the sense of the gathering was favorable, and the resolution passed. Quote, "Inviting the ladies to share in the doings of the convention." Unquote. Among those who favored the resolution from the outset were J. L. Watson, chair of the session, and T. J. Merritt, a member of the business committee, who brought the women's resolution to the floor initially. Both men's wives were present at the convention and supported the resolution. So they had to support it. There is no record of any representative from Cincinnati voting or speaking against the women's participation in the convention. This incident reflected the reality of Black society in Cincinnati, which saw significant roles in the family and community economy assumed by Black women translated into important political influence. Footnote. The African American leaders of Cincinnati were a literate group. Among almost all were able to read and write. This was due in large part to the availability of private and later public education to the Black community. Literacy was one of the most important areas of difference between Black leaders and non-leaders in the city. Although the significance of this difference should not be exaggerated, the general literacy rate among Cincinnati Blacks was between 60 and 70% during the 1840s and 1850s. That is a relatively high literacy rate for a predominantly Southern-born Black community, reflecting the general commitment to education among Cincinnati's Black people. This commitment was demonstrated in the struggle for increased public support for Black instruction. It resulted in the establishment of a separate Black-controlled administrative board for African American schools. Education was an important consideration when leaders were being chosen in Black Cincinnati. Yet the relatively high literacy rate for the entire community lessened the possibility that this leadership would become an isolated intellectual elite adrift in a sea of literacy. The most important evidence of an elite leadership was revealed by our analysis of the significance of color among Cincinnati African Americans. There is a strong evidence that color stratification was an important source of division within the community. Such division was not unique to Black Cincinnati. The literature is replete with evidence that light-skinned African Americans often held favored positions within the general society and sometimes formed a special elite within the Black community. Thus, we were particularly interested in comparisons based on shade of color. The United States Census in 1850 and 1860 designated African Americans as either Black or mulatto. This designation depended largely on the judgment of the census taker and was likely to reflect color rather than ancestry. Most of Cincinnati's free blacks, especially those born in the South, were of racially mixed ancestry and likely to be light in complexion. The fact that masters were most willing to free their mulatto offspring partly explains the large percentage of mulattoes in the free Southern Black population. Also, because masters were sometimes willing to allow their slave kin to learn trades, many mulatto slaves had skills that they would use to generate funds to purchase their own freedom. Thus, mulattoes were freed in disproportionate numbers and were able to leave the South, many migrating to antebellum Cincinnati and quote unquote lightening the city's Black community. Footnote: by 1850, mulattoes accounted for 54% of adult African Americans in Cincinnati. Although this figure dropped to just over 47% by 1860, this high proportion of light-skinned blacks was far in excess of the regional average for the North, 31%, or even the Upper South, 35%. Cincinnati's percentage of mulattoes in its free Black population was higher than that for the Midwestern region comprised of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Only in the lower South was the percentage higher, 76%. Footnote: a partial explanation for the high number of mulattoes in Cincinnati was the tendency of free blacks from the neighboring slave states of Kentucky and Virginia to move into southern Ohio. The Virginia Assembly ruled in 1806 that any slave set free after May of that year must be transported out of the state or face re-enslavement. After the Nat Turner slave uprising of 1831, Virginia passed additional measures that made life almost intolerable for free blacks. Thus, during the 1830s and continuing through the 1840s, Ohio received a sizable migration of free blacks, many of them the racially mixed offspring of slaveholders and their slaves. John Mercer Langston and his brothers Gideon and Charles were among those free blacks who came to Ohio during the 1830s. They were supported in part by a legacy from their father, Ralph Quarles, a white Virginia planter. John stayed for a brief time in Cincinnati before going on to Northern Ohio and eventually to Oberlin Collegiate Institute, where he made a name for himself educationally and in local politics. At Oberlin, Langston found several other mulattoes whose education, like his own, was funded to varying degrees by well-to-do white fathers. Footnote: look that up. Such financing of the education of mixed-race blacks from the South in northern schools was not unusual. Cincinnati's Hiram Gilmore High School, established in 1844, offered the only advanced education available to blacks in the region. Growing from an initial student body of 20, enrollment reached almost 200 by 1847. Among those who attended were a number of mulattoes sent there by Southern white slaveholding families. Although scholarship aid was available for students unable to finance their education, some of these mulattoes were supported by a white parent. P.B.S. Pinchback of New Orleans, who became a powerful political force in Louisiana during Reconstruction, was educated at the school for a time before the death of his father and benefactor, a white planter, forced him to cut his schooling short. Footnote: in this city, with so many mulattoes, it is not surprising that the African American leadership was disproportionately light. By 1850, at least 7 out of every 10 leaders were of racially mixed ancestry. And although by 1860 the figure had dropped slightly to 65%, there was no mistaking the distinctive shade of the city's black leadership. The high percentage of mulattoes in Cincinnati reflected the general Southern character of the city and illustrated the general Southern structure of the black community. In Southern cities like Charleston and New Orleans, where mulattoes formed well over half of the African American population, they often separated themselves into an elite mulatto society, partly influenced by Caribbean and Latin American traditions related to color distinction. Whites sometimes encouraged this phenomenon by according lighter-skinned African Americans privileges not extended to darker blacks. Footnote: in antebellum Charleston, for example, several prominent mulatto families amassed great wealth and lived in relative comfort. They associated with others of their shade in the socio-political organizations, like the Brown Fellowship Society, which limited its membership by wealth and lightness of skin color. William Ellison and his family were economically secure within the mulatto community of 19th century Charleston. The Ellisons held slaves, were successful in business, and could count on the patronage of some of the wealthiest and most powerful whites in the city. They had extremely limited contact with the black masses and almost never interacted socially with the darker, poorer members of their race. The Ellisons and others like them consciously isolated themselves from other black people as one strategy for ensuring continued tolerance and paternalistic support from elite whites. This pattern of mulatto self-separation to maintain important white support was distinctly Southern, found most explicitly in the port cities of the Old South. As one historian explained, South Carolina, quote, the Palmetto State, refused to relegate free mulattoes to the status of blacks, slave or free, unquote. Footnote: the voluminous literature on the special role of quadroons and octoroons and the elite social and political clubs in 19th century New Orleans that catered to them complements the Charleston illustration. New Orleans mulattoes were not treated on a par with whites, were a privileged class. Let me read that again. I got it wrong. The voluminous literature on the social role of quadroons and octoroons and the elite social and political clubs in the 19th century New Orleans that catered to them complements the Charleston illustration. New Orleans mulattoes, while not treated on a par with whites, were a privileged class. As in Charleston, they formed a social and economic elite with special ties to the white aristocracy. Local ordinances restricting the association of free mulattoes and dark-skinned slaves gave official sanction to color distinctions. Unofficially, New Orleans society winked at regularly held quadroon balls at which sexual liaisons between mulatto women and white men were commonplace. Footnote. Some mulattoes in both cities held slaves, and one report showed that in 1830, 735 New Orleans free African Americans, almost all of them mulatto, held a total of more than 2,300 slaves. Outside of the city lived some of the wealthiest mulattoes in the country, including the Metoyer, Metoyer, Metoyer family, which owned over 1,000 acres and 300 slaves. These mulattoes thought of themselves as very different from other African Americans and acted, quote, as a distinct racial ethnic group, unquote. At the opening of the Civil War, mulatto planters in and around New Orleans formed the Native Guard to protect the elite against slave uprisings. They subsequently offered their military services to the Confederacy, and in the spring of 1861, the governor authorized the formation of an African American military unit to guard the New Orleans against Union attack. The position and status of mulattoes in Cincinnati confirmed this regional pattern of mulatto privilege. Although antebellum Ohio law restricted the franchise to white males, twice in the 1840s, state courts upheld the right of mulattoes to vote, claiming that they were not, quote-unquote, Negroes. In 1859, the state legislature, then dominated by Democrats, passed a measure forbidding anyone from voting who had a distinct and visible admixture of African blood, quote unquote. The Ohio Supreme Court, however, further recognized the distinction between mulattoes and other African Americans, ruling that this law could not stop males with more than 50% white ancestry from voting. Footnote. Although there is little evidence that Cincinnati mulattoes voted in significant numbers before the Civil War, this legal distinction may be an important indication of the general advantages they had in dealing with whites. This fact would have made lighter blacks valuable as African American spokesmen to white society and might help to account for their disproportionate representation among the black leadership. It also might have given rise to a color elite such as that found in cities farther south. However, there was an important difference between the role of mulattoes in New Orleans, Charleston, and other port cities of the Deep South and that in Cincinnati. In the Deep South, prominent light-skinned blacks were sometimes singled out as targets of racial hostility by those intolerant of African American success. Often, mulattoes found the protection of paternalistic influential whites their only shield from capricious racial attack. In order to attract and reassure these white patrons, Southern mulattoes found it advantageous to distance themselves from darker blacks. By contrast, mulattoes in Cincinnati were less likely to be detached from and more likely to be politically allied with the masses of blacks in community-wide activism. The complexity of this issue is increased in light of the marriage trends among the city's African Americans. Marriage patterns of the local leaders indicate a conscious a consciousness of color among that group comparable to that found in Charleston, New Orleans, and other deep South cities. The rate of intracolor marriage, that is, mulattoes marrying mulattoes and blacks marrying other blacks, was strikingly high. Almost every male mulatto, 93% in 1850, dropping slightly to 89% by 1860, who married chose a mulatto spouse. The rate was comparable for mulatto women, although slightly lower, 84% in 1850 and 80% in 1860. Darker black men and women who married were almost as likely to marry someone of their approximate hue, 76% in 1850 and 74% in 1860. Footnote. Among the African American leadership, the importance of color in the selection of a mate was comparably high. In 1850, all married mulatto leaders had mulatto spouses. And in 1860, every mulatto leader was married to a mulatto, except for one, George Johnson, a barber from New York, whose wife was a white Englishwoman. In 1850, darker black leaders appear to have had greater access to lighter spouses than other darker blacks in the community. In that year, 50% of them were married to mates lighter than themselves. An indication, perhaps, that the status accorded community leaders. An indication, perhaps, of the status accorded community leaders. So a darker-skinned community leader could find a lighter-skinned mate because of their status. Oh my goodness. These marriage patterns grouped blacks and mulattoes into separate households, clustering them in wards of the city by shade of color. See Table 3.4. Wow. At mid-century, mulattoes were overrepresented in two of the city's most heavily African American wards, Ward 6 and 9. And underrepresented in two others, Wards 1 and 4. Footnote. By 1860, a population shift and a redrawing of ward lines increased the clustering of African Americans by color. See Table 3.5. Mulattoes were accounted for slightly more than half of the city's blacks, were underrepresented in two wards, slightly overrepresented in two others, and substantially overrepresented in another. Footnote. Mulattoes were not isolated from darker blacks, however. This clustering of shade of color, apparently within wards, did not occur within neighborhoods. Henry Louis Taylor, Jr., in his study of residential patterns in Antebellum, Cincinnati, plotted the black community street by street. He concluded that there was no substantial clustering by color within neighborhoods. See Chapter 4. While mulattoes tended to cluster in a few wards of the city, within these wards, blacks were not separated by shade of color. The residential distribution of African American leaders reflected this pattern. Although leaders lived disproportionately in wards 1 and 9, substantial numbers of them resided in every ward in which there were black people. As we shall see shortly, the occupations held by these leaders should have made it economically possible for them to live in the more desirable residential areas. Nevertheless, in 1850, almost 2 of every 5 leaders lived in the East End Factory District of Ward 9, an area known as Bucktown, one of the city's poorest sections. Although the percentage of leaders living in Bucktown dropped, by 1860, to under 1/4. This area remained the section of greatest leader residence. Other leaders were scattered throughout the other heavily African American wards. This residential intermingling of leaders and non-leader households encouraged and facilitated regular contact between the community leadership and its constituency. It also reflected the racial discrimination that limited the areas of the city open to blacks and enforced their residential clustering. Even if leaders had wanted to spatially separate themselves from other blacks, it would have been impossible. Footnote: the residential integration of leaders with other blacks occurred despite their occupational dissimilarity. The great majority of the blacks in Cincinnati, 85% in 1850 and 1860, worked in unskilled or very low-skilled jobs. This was true partly because most blacks had few skills, but also because there was strong opposition to blacks employing any skills they did possess. White employers who were willing to hire blacks in skilled jobs often faced extreme censure from those white workers who saw themselves in direct competition with African American labor. Their trade associations, dominated by German and, to a lesser extent, Irish immigrants, not only forbade black membership but also pressured white businesses not to take on black workers in any but quote-unquote appropriate, that is, low-level and unskilled employment. In 1830, one leader of a local trade group was tried by his organization for the crime of assisting a young black man in learning a trade. Footnote, look that up. A few African American craftsmen found work within the black community, but general poverty among blacks ensured that such work was limited. Sometimes white abolitionists hired black skilled workers. One local newspaper called upon all friends of the colored people to, quote unquote, encourage their industry as a part of the, quote unquote, great duty of abolitionists. Yet, quote, few abolitionists ever called upon them, black artisans, unquote, to do other than menial work. One black Cincinnatian complained, quote, we have among us carpenters, plasterers, masons, etc., whose skill as workmen is confessed, and yet they find no encouragement, not even among white friends, unquote. Footnote. Mulattoes fared better in this restrictive environment than darker blacks. A strengthening economy, especially after 1840, and a large pool of skilled mulatto workers, combined with Southern traditions adhered to by the large numbers of Southern-born whites and blacks in the city, was enough to temper some of the objections to employment opportunities for lighter African Americans. In 1850, 18% of mulattoes versus 10% of darker blacks found work above the lowest skill levels. In 1860, the percentages were 20% for mulattoes and 10% for darker blacks. Thus, the occupational structure of the city's black community favored its lighter members and in so doing resembled the Southern urban pattern, which reserved many skilled positions for mulattoes. Yet, the advantage of light skin must not be exaggerated because the vast majority of mulattoes, 80%, remain in the ranks of the unskilled. Footnote. Leaders were, however, more likely to hold jobs above the unskilled level than any other single group of African Americans. Leadership status was a better predictor of relatively high occupational level than shade of color. African American leaders held higher level jobs, 47% in 1850 and 43% in 1860, roughly twice the rate for mulattoes in the community. The percentage of mulatto leaders was even higher over 50% in 1850, and just slightly less in 1860. Barbering and hairdressing accounted for a significant proportion of mulatto skills and was the most popular profession among leaders. Immigrant workers were generally tolerant of blacks holding these surface jobs. Those jobs, like storekeeper and small business owner, were not direct were not directed primarily towards serving whites, tended to deal with customers from the black community. Thus, Cincinnati, with its sizable black community, offered not only middle-level jobs in their general economy, but also employment opportunities for blacks serving their own community. It was hardly surprising then that among these predominantly Southern-born blacks, already advantaged mulattoes stepped forward to run these local businesses. From this occupationally advantaged group came a disproportionate number of the community's leaders, who were more economically stable than most of their followers. In several ways, then, Cincinnati's African American leaders were distinct from most of the city's blacks. They were disproportionately lighter in skin color and more secure occupationally. They were also more highly literate and just a bit older than the average black Cincinnatian. These observations point to the presence of a local leadership that stood at the social and economic level above other Cincinnati blacks. Yet these leaders were very much like others in the black community and in other important ways. They were generally Southern-born and shared a general social, economic, and political environment that was restrictive for all black people. When the black laws were applied, they were applied to all identified as quote-unquote colored people. When white mobs invaded the black community in 1829, 1836, and again in 1841, they attacked blacks indiscriminately and destroyed the property of those fortunate enough to own any, regardless of their status in the community. Cincinnati African Americans of all social and economic levels shared a common vulnerability, and leaders emerged as advocates of programs and projects that held community-wide appeal. Education for black children and adults, care for widows and orphans, the fight against the restrictive laws under which all blacks suffered, and the anti-slavery crusade were the causes of black leaders and of their constituents. Nor was there a major attempt by any single group within the community to take exclusive control over the leadership. Given the advantages held by mulattoes within the city, one of two situations might have existed within black Cincinnati. Mulattoes might have formed a separate community and run their own affairs independently of the city's darker African Americans, as happened in several southern port cities. They might also have used their relatively privileged status to freeze darker blacks out of the leadership positions. Neither happened in Cincinnati. Darker blacks were not excluded from leadership positions. They increased their proportion among leaders 30% in 1850 and 35% in 1860 at roughly the same rate as their presence grew in the city. Nor were darker blacks relegated to unimportant positions of leadership. When black Cincinnatians were represented outside their local community, they selected delegates of many hues. John I. Gaines, John Liverpool, William Casey, and other mulattoes served with darker blacks like Joseph J. Fowler, a huckster originally from Kentucky, John Jackson, a cooper from Virginia, Isaac Wilson, a laborer from North Carolina, and William W. Watson, a barber born in Virginia. All were part of the delegation elected from Hamilton County to the Convention of the Colored Freemen of Ohio in 1852. Jackson represented his community several times during the 1850s, serving on a variety of committees, including the convention's Central Committee in 1852. Watson served on the Finance Committee for the convention. Footnote. When black Cincinnatians addressed more local problems, darker blacks also participated as leaders along with mulattoes, and during community celebrations, darker blacks were not given inferior roles. Daniel Gray, darker than most of his brethren, was elected as the Grand Marshal for the annual 5th of July, quote-unquote, parade in 1834. He was aided by two assistant marshals, the mulattoes William and Josiah Smith. 15 years later, when an observer reported on the annual colored procession, quote-unquote, in honor of the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies, he noted, quote, among them we noticed every shade of color, from the darky so black that charcoal would almost make a white mark, to those of straight hair and nearly white, unquote. Footnote. Darker skin did not exclude African Americans from community leadership. The leaders were alert to any situation that might exacerbate the sensitive issue of color. In 1844, John I. Gaines, a mulatto member of the Central Committee of the Convention of the Colored Freemen of Ohio, warned white authorities in the city that black people would not tolerate the establishment of a separate school for mulattoes. Quote, this, I anticipate, would be fraught with evil consequences, unquote, he argued. Quote, it would not only divide the colored children, but create prejudices too intolerable to be borne, unquote. Instead, Gaines demanded that public education be provided for all black children, regardless of color. Footnote. African American leaders in Cincinnati and many other blacks in the community who could not be identified as leaders often express this view of racial solidarity, and more important, they worked both through formally organized groups and informally to aid those in need. Robert Gordon, a black coal dealer born in Virginia, devoted much of his life to establishing a colored orphan asylum, and then bequeathed $25,000 to start the Home for Colored Widows. William Casey, a prominent leader throughout most of the antebellum years, adopted Emily, a young girl who worked as a washerwoman. He gave her his last name, and for many years Emily lived with the Casey family. After William died in the mid-1850s, Emily inherited a portion of his estate and continued to live with his widow, Maria Casey. Footnote. There was also significant association between the community leaders and those less well-known and less well-placed in the community. John Liverpool, a prominent Virginia-born mulatto barber, was willing to post bond of surety for debts of the modest estate of Thomas Basco, a black boatman from Virginia. This was a great service, no doubt, to the widow, Mildred Basco, who even with this aid was forced to take in washing to make ends meet within a few years of her husband's death. Basco was not Liverpool's only associate who worked at a less prestigious job. Liverpool's son-in-law worked for a time as a boatman. Footnote. Other examples of such associations can be found in the probate records of black Cincinnatians, which reveal many associational networks that cut across class and color lines within the African American community. Perhaps the community was too small and its problems too broad and too critical to allow hard and fast distinctions. Not that there were no groupings of choice. Marriage patterns clearly show that color preferences were exercised, but these preferences did not detach a light, wealthy elite from black society, nor did they predict community leadership. Other factors were also important. Samuel Carroll, an active member of the Life Guards, which protected fugitive slaves seeking shelter in the city, was selected to represent the community before city authorities because, quote unquote, being a Pennsylvania man, he could speak up pert before white folks. The report went on to say, quote unquote, most of the others were from Kentucky and were afraid of white men. Footnote. Thus, the intangible, often unpredictable factors of personality and personal experience were also important considerations in the selection of community leaders. Surely, the most educated and the most financially secure had advantages in this regard, but leadership was not closed to others. Local black leaders did comprise a distinct and comparatively privileged group. They pushed for middle-class goals. Education, civil rights, and economic opportunity were high on their list, but these were also the goals of most black Cincinnatians. These leaders were forced to deal with white authority, but they did not hold their leadership position at the pleasure of that authority. Unlike the mulatto elite of the southern port cities, Cincinnati leaders, whatever their shade of color, were responsible directly to the black community and held their positions because they were elected at community mass meetings. They were selected by, and therefore could be rejected by, the community. Not only were African American leaders of Cincinnati and most of their followers committed to self-help and civil rights for free blacks, they also spoke and acted against slavery individually and in organized groups, and they raised funds to support the abolition movement. They were not willing to abandon their friends and families bound in slavery any more than they were willing to ignore the injustices they suffered in their daily lives as free people of color. This study strongly suggests that local leaders in antebellum Cincinnati were people with advantages. As a group, they were comparatively mature, literate, and well employed. They were not, however, isolated from their constituents. This was so partly because the relatively small size of the black community made isolation difficult, and because racial restrictions were imposed upon all African Americans regardless of position. The situation in Cincinnati, with the major proportion of its black and white citizenry Southern-born and its comparatively privileged mulatto population, exhibited many of the same characteristics as the situation in Southern cities. Yet, in many ways, it also illustrated a Northern pattern that allowed for public black protest and social and political activism. In the slave-holding South, free blacks were restricted from holding open mass gatherings, and mulattoes were likely to remain socially and politically separated from the masses of darker blacks, at least publicly. In Cincinnati, although mulattoes married among themselves and held a disproportionate share of skilled employment and wealth, they did not constitute a separate color caste. Instead, they led black protest against slavery and racial restrictions. Cincinnati was a city in the middle, a border city in the truest sense. Its black leadership reflected that position, and it constituted something of an elite, but achieved its status by engaging in public protest instead of drawing inward and isolating itself from the rest of the black community. The nature of Cincinnati's local black leadership was determined not only by the special talents of individuals, but also by the structural pattern of the city straddling north and south. And that's the end of chapter 3. We'll be proceeding with chapter 4. God bless. Bye-bye.